Good evening, everybody. I think we'll get going in a few seconds now. It's almost, in fact, I think it is 7:30. So we'll get cracking. So yeah, good evening, everyone, and welcome to what is now our fourth in this winter series of webinars from Germinal. So thanks for logging in. Thanks for your time this evening. I'm Helen Matthews. I think probably a few of you know. And tonight we've got Ben Wixey and William Fleming sharing their knowledge and expertise with us on mixture formulation. Germinal, as I'm sure you also know, we are a 6th generation family-owned business, mostly perhaps well known for our association with Aberystwyth University, where we have an embedded team of plant breeders working in the within the IBERS Institute, breeding ryegrasses and clovers and so on. And we have a continuing investment, therefore, in innovation and research and development. And really core to what we do is sharing knowledge and expertise to help our customers and farmers ultimately stay ahead of the game. I should tell you, as the meeting goes on, we will be recording the meeting. And please do ask questions. In the middle of your screen at the bottom, if you run your mouse over it, there'll be a Q&A button. And we will endeavour to answer all of them. Some we will perhaps take during the actual presentations if it's appropriate. Otherwise, there should be 10 or 15 minutes at the end when we can deal with the questions then. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ben Wixey.
Thank you, Helen. Good evening, everybody. The first thing I need to say is it's actually probably impossible for us to cover all the mixtures that are available to farmers from merchants and the likes, because of all the different soil types, the different rainfall, the different animal type, the different grazing or cutting regimes. So what I plan to do tonight is talk through the grass species that are available to be used in these mixtures, the benefits and the drawbacks, so that hopefully you can understand what the characteristics are and then use it as a reference point when you're talking to your merchant about the mixture that might be suitable for your ground. There are two elements at the very outset, as far as I'm concerned, to discuss when you're looking at selecting a mixture. Do I have the right species in the mixture I'm about to buy? And are the varieties of those species the best that's available on the market? And that second part I want to cover first, and just quickly. And the only way that you can find out that independent information on the varieties is from the recommended lists. So there are two in GB, one in England and Wales and one in Scotland. They are independently tested grass trial systems from four or five different sites across the UK, and their grasses and clovers that are trialled over 4 years. So different weather patterns and different cutting and grazing regimes, and then all the information from our breeding program and every other breeding program that wants to submit grasses to it. And then they're all there on one page for you to analyze. The grass recommended lists are a guarantee for you as a farmer that the grasses you're about to buy have been tried and tested in this country over 4 years and work under the conditions that we have. It's now very easy to import and bring grass seed in from all over the world, and it might grow very well in Peru or Italy or New Zealand or Australia. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to do well in our country. So by picking varieties that are on the recommended list, we know that they've been trialled in this country for 4 years at least, and therefore we know that they are good. They have to be, a grass variety has to be better than what is already on the list to get on the list. So it's a continual improvement of grass varieties that get onto the list. And that improvement runs at about 1% in terms of dry matter every year, and about 0.5 percentage point of D value. So it is a continual improvement. If you think some of the fields on the farm only get reseeded 1 every 10 years, there's 10% yield increase just by selecting the most modern up-to-date grass varieties that are available on that recommended list. Now, I have to warn you, these recommended lists are incredibly dull. They are table after table of data on grass varieties. So what we've done, and this will be the only hard sell tonight, is certain characteristics that are on there we can make into spreadsheets, to bar charts and graphs very easily. And this is one of the characteristics. This is energy yield per hectare in a grazing situation. And obviously, the higher the energy yield, the better. We all know that D value and energy is what drives livestock production. If you think about a sheep unit, then 90% of the energy requirement of that ewe for the year comes from grass. 70 to 80% with a beef animal, and 60% on a dairy herd. So depending on what type of dairy system, obviously, but energy per hectare is the key driver to livestock performance. So having grass varieties that are high in their energy per hectare performance is obviously crucial. And here's the hard sell. Obviously, of the top varieties, 4 out of the top 6 are from Germinal, 9 out of the top 18, and you can see most of our varieties, if not all of them, are at that top end of the scale. So the breeders are doing something right in terms of energy per hectare. I am, of course, talking about perennial ryegrass here, because perennial ryegrass is probably 75 to 80% of all the seed type that's sold in agriculture in this country. The other 15% would be Italian ryegrasses and hybrid grasses, which we'll cover in a bit. And the rest of it would be clovers, white, red, other types, Cocksfoot, Timothys, fescues, Festuloliums, that sort of thing. So we're mainly concentrating on perennial ryegrass types. And I just want to quickly, I'm sorry if this is teaching grandmother suck eggs or whatever the phrase is, but I want to just quickly go over identification of perennial ryegrass in the field. It has a dull, non-shiny upper side to the leaf with ribs in it, and the back side of the leaf, the underside, is shiny. The base of the plant is red, and the tiller is folded. So as you spin a perennial ryegrass tiller over in your hand, you'll get resistance, then it will flip, and then resistance, and then it will flip. That is obviously folded to the side of us, looking side on, and this one here is obviously on the 90-degree angle to that. The red color at the base is not purely only from perennial ryegrass. There are other species that have red coloring at the base, but that combined with no horizontal roots on stolons or rhizomes is a good indication that it's perennial ryegrass. That combined with all the other traits I've just talked about will identify it as perennial ryegrass. When it's in ear, it's a lot easier, clearly. So yeah, that's what we want to identify in the fields. Okay, there's diploids and tetraploids, Ploidy, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So why do we grow perennial ryegrass? Why is the biggest market in this country perennial ryegrass? Well, it's because it has, under our weather conditions and the amount of moisture we have, it has the highest long-term grass yields that you can get. It is very responsive to nitrogen. It's very versatile, both in types of the soil conditions that you can put it on. Yes, we'd be the first to agree that on very dry soils with a lot of drought proning, that plant does dry up in the summer. But on most situations, in most rainfall types, perennial ryegrass is the best plant you can have. Not only is it responsive to nitrogen, its quality in terms of its D value and energy, which we've already talked about, are the highest that there are. So it is a very good all-round flexible plant. It recovers well after grazing or cutting, depending on obviously how tight you cut it. And it is just versatile. We can cut it or graze it. We can use it with sheep, with beef, with dairy. And as I say, versatile on all soil types as well. So that's perennial ryegrass type. And as I say, it's the biggest proportion of grass seeds sold in this country. Then you've got Italian ryegrass types, which are the highest yielding type in a short-term grass. Again, very responsive to nitrogen and very quick to recover after a defoliation, whether grazing or cutting. They are slightly less flexible in the management that you can impose on them, because obviously they don't hold, as you can see here, quite open in the ground after a cut. They don't have the ground cover that a perennial has. And in dry situations particularly, they will go very stemmy on you in the midsummer if there's a lack of moisture. They are higher yielding than a perennial ryegrass type, but as I say, they only last for 1 or 2 years. Please don't be tempted to take them for longer, because as you go into a 3rd year, especially with Italian ryegrass, no matter how much nitrogen you put in it, it won't produce you a leaf. It'll just throw up a seed head at a certain time of the year. So yes, for 18 months, 2 years, no problem at all. And obviously there is an annual type to this, which is a Westerwold's ryegrass. But again, it's very similar in its growth characteristics to Italian ryegrass. There are some drawbacks with Italian ryegrass, especially if you're including them in an arable type of rotation. The plant forms viable seeds very, very quickly when the ear comes out. And if those seeds are allowed to drop to the ground, then they can come back in the following crops. And there is some anecdotal reports of Roundup becoming glyphosate resistance, but perhaps more worrying than that is the resistance to selective grassland herbicides. And so we are finding problems with that. So it is massively important that if you're growing Italian ryegrasses, you should be cutting them on a very frequent basis to stop that plant from heading and seeding into the ground. They grow at lower temperatures, which is why they grow earlier in the spring and later in the autumn. And if you're going to put them in mixtures, go all Italian ryegrass. Don't be mixing Italian ryegrass with perennial ryegrass. They grow, as I say, at different speeds, and they regrow at different rates, and you'll get very, very stemmy grass growth in a perennial ley if you're waiting for the perennial to come to head. But we'll cover that in more detail in a bit. So very, very useful grasses, and they certainly have their place in our agricultural system, but we need to know where that place is. Then, of course, we've got hybrids, which are a combination of the two, of perennial and Italian. They're not true hybrids like a maize hybrid. You don't get F1 vigor, hybrid vigor, but they are, what we've tried to do with the breeding is to encompass or to have the characteristics of the parent plant. So you need to know with a hybrid ryegrass the parentage. Is it an Italian ryegrass type or is it a perennial type? Because obviously if you're using an Italian ryegrass type and you put it into a perennial ley, you've got the same issues as if you were using a perennial. There are the last 3 to 4 years, so we've increased the longevity of an Italian ryegrass plant. They're a better quality than an Italian ryegrass plant, but again, they can run stemmy in the summer. I do understand with hybrids why people mix them with perennial, because they do have that earlier spring growth characteristic. And if that is something that you need, then using 3, 4, 5 kilos of hybrid in a perennial mixture can work. Just remember that the hybrids will only last 3 to 4 years, and you're putting a long-term lay in. What's going to happen after that? One of the other characteristics of hybrid, because most of them tend to be tetraploid, they're quite big seeded. So they do have a role to play in overseeding. We're not going to that tonight, but there is a role there for them in that scenario. Because they're bigger seeded, you get fewer per kilo. And therefore, if you're growing an all hybrid 3 to 4 year ley, you need to make sure the seed rate is at the higher end. And we'd be 14 to 15 kilos for a hybrid because of that big seed requirement. So moving on to Timothy. Timothy's a very, very good grass with good grazing yields when the plant is young. So I don't mean in the terms of its number of years old, but in terms of the regrowth after the last grazing or defoliation or cutting. That young leafy plant is very high in digestibility and very good inside the animal. As the leaf gets slightly older, so it becomes more lignified and stemmy, and it becomes less palatable to the animals. There are up to 30% differences between the early spring growth of Timothy varieties on the recommended list. So you need to make sure that the variety of Timothy that you're using, if you're going to use one, has got that early growth characteristic. So varieties like Presto and Coma have very good early spring growth. There are other varieties that have other characteristics, but spring growth isn't one of them. So make sure that you're picking the right characteristics for what you're doing. As I was saying, not so good with silage because of that lignification that comes in with ear and stem growth. As much as 14 points drop in D value at silage compared to a perennial ryegrass, which is about 2 megajoules of energy per kilogram of dry matter. So a fair sizable drop in D value for silage. Very good in hay conditions, very good hay in terms of a hard fiber, dust-free hay can be produced from all timothy crops. The biggest characteristic of timothy, though, that it needs to be considered in a mixture is its winter hardiness and its ability to cope with wetter, tougher conditions. It doesn't mind having its feet wet, it doesn't mind altitude, and it doesn't mind tough winters. It is a tougher plant. It's probably the toughest plant of the high value energy plants that we use. So if you've got challenging conditions, timothy ought to be something that you're thinking about including in your mixture. One small point to be aware of with timothy, as you can see from the seed heads there, the seed is very, very small. You get perhaps 5 times the number of seeds in a kilo than you would do with perennial ryegrass. So an inclusion rate of about 1 kilo to the acre or 2.5 kilos to the hectare, if it is a perennial ryegrass sward with a bit of timothy in it, is about the maximum that you want. If there's more seed in it than that, and it's not a specialist timothy mixture, then you perhaps ought to be asking, why is there so much timothy in it? Because it yields so much and the seed is so small, the timothy price per kilo is roughly the same as a perennial ryegrass. It's not quite the same at the moment because there is a worldwide shortage of timothy, so it's slightly more expensive than a perennial at the moment. But in general, it's normally about the same price. So if somebody is putting in more than a kilo of timothy in a mixture, you might just want to ask the question is, why is it such a high inclusion rate in that? Cocksfoot, again, very good yielding grass in terms of quality when it's very young, when it's in that leafy stage. It's got very good regrowth after cutting or defoliation. As a young plant, it's very good quality, which I've said. The spring growth characteristic of Cocksfoot is amazing. It's one of the earliest grasses to come out of the starting blocks. You'll see it in the hedgerows by April. It has its benefits. It's used a lot with timothy in stewardship mixtures. I'm sure you will have all seen the clumpy growth that you get on a 6-meter margin that's very good for insects and small animals to hide from predators in that clumpy plant. Very good for that. Not always the best use or the best growth habit for a silage making situation you can imagine. What it does have is a phenomenal rooting structure. So in dry conditions and on dry ground, a dry bank or a free draining field, then Cocksfoot might be something that's worth considering, especially if you're going to graze it a lot. If you're going to grow Cocksfoot, I'm always inclined to put a fair bit of Cocksfoot in and really go for it. And as long as you can keep on it in terms of management and continually grazing it, I don't mean set stocking, but I mean coming back to it quickly, then Cocksfoot has its benefit on the farm. Tall fescues and meadow fescues, well, again, good yields, reasonable yields for grazing, good longevity. They don't respond to nitrogen the same as a perennial will, and they don't have the same quality that a perennial will. But what they do have is a stress tolerance to both drought and waterlogging. Neither of them mind, or they've got resilience to those traits, and that's why we are breeding them into perennial ryegrasses, not for their response to nitrogen or their quality as a leaf, but for these stress traits that they have. They are unfortunately very slow to establish. So the next photo I'm going to show you is plots down at Exeter, on a farm just below Exeter, where it's a droughty site, it dries out in the summer, and we're testing there the drought resistance of some of our varieties. We've got a new variety called Aberroot, which we're hoping gets onto the recommended list this year. And that is a perennial cross fescue with drought resistance. So it's trialing there. This next plot is a pure tall fescue from France. And I'm putting it in just to show you the delay in establishment. This is the perennial, this is the tall fescue plot. And you can see here the tall fescue grass coming. Either side of it is perennial ryegrass. These were drilled at the beginning of September. And this was taken just before Christmas. So it does have disadvantages in terms of establishment and disadvantages in terms of quality. So rather than using tall fescue or meadow fescue in a mixture, probably better, we certainly believe, to use it in the breeding program, which is what we're doing in Festuloliums. So Festulolium, as the name suggests, is a cross between a fescue and a lolium plant, perennial, whether that be that Italian or perennial ryegrass. Again, as with the hybrid, I suggest you find out what the parentage is of the Festulolium, because Italian Festuloliums will behave much differently to perennial Festuloliums. We have an Italian type Festulolium called Abeniche. It's on the recommended list. It's on there as a hybrid because we wanted to prove that it lasts 3 years as opposed to a normal Italian lasting 18 months, 2 years. And it does that. It got onto the recommended list under those characteristics. But if you use that in a long-term lay, it will not survive. So knowing the parentage and putting them in the right conditions are important when reading your mixtures. Don't just see Festulolium and go, ah, brilliant, good drought resistance, I must have it, because there are differences between them. I've mentioned Aberroot, which is the first perennial that we hope to get on the recommended list, first Festulolium perennial type later this summer. So the last slide from me is, for now, is just about the establishment of these grasses. Quite a useful table just to look at, the perennial ryegrass being 7 out of 10, 10 being the highest for the quickest of that characteristic. Italian ryegrass and hybrids, very quick to establish, big seeds, big yields. Timothy, Cocksfoots, fescues a bit slower. Festulolium, as I said, know the type of Festulolium, Italian ryegrass type or perennial type. And then the first year growth where you can see the figures and the patterns, and then continued growth. So after 4 or 5 years, 6 years, the perennial still maintaining in the sward, Italian type and hybrids have gone, Timothy, Cocksfoots, fescues, yeah, all very good longevity wise. Italian type Festulolium gone. So that table is just quite there, good as a reference point. So that's it for me. Over to William. I have to now stop sharing my screen.
And just while we're doing that, 2 or 3 questions that it's probably fairly relevant while William's just setting his screen up, probably relevant to ask you at the moment. Susan asked, are there any varieties that that are maybe more suitable for low end situations?
In terms of perennial, if you mean, then I'm not sure that there's any difference between perennial varieties. There's work done on the trialing systems at high end and low end, and the order of varieties doesn't tend to change that much. But in terms of grasses, then some of the fescue types might be more productive in a low end situation. In a low end situation, though, the total amount of forage produced, and I'm thinking about nitrogen coming from clovers, as William's about to talk about, as well as from nitrogen, then we can use more productive grasses by using clover in that situation. But I think some of the fescues, to be fair, would probably be more at home in a low nitrogen situation.
Thank you. Yeah, another one from Rod. Can you comment on Italians? Is there any other species that have a herbicide resistance that we need to be aware of? Don't know whether we can comment on that.
I'm not that gets mentioned to me on a regular basis. I don't know if either of you two have any comments. I mean, it's sometimes talked about clover being difficult to kill, but I think that's more to do with the leaf area when we're using glyphosate to burn a sward off, the leaf area to take the chemical in rather than any resistance. No, I can't think. I know which Rod that is, and I can't think which species he's perhaps referring to. Perhaps he'd enlighten us a bit. I don't know, Helen, have you got any answers?
No, I'm not sure. The resistance to glyphosate building up maybe in a rotation, but we probably ought to have a quick chat with John Ferry and get back to you on that one.
Yeah.
And then there's another question, just probably pertinent at the moment, from Dowie. Can you just comment on the inclusion rate of Cocksfoot in mixtures? What would be your inclusion rate?
I said towards the end of the Cocksfoot bit, I think I tend to go higher with a Cocksfoot. If you've got a field that is going to burn up for long periods of the summer, then yes, include Cocksfoot, and include it at a rate that will be some benefit to you. If you have fields that dry up for short periods of time, is the inclusion of Cocksfoot worth it because of the negative quality and response to nitrogen characteristics that you can get with it, and the lower quality silage? Is it worth it for that short period of time? That's a question only you as the farmer, knowing your ground, can answer. If you've got long periods of time where it's necessary to have it, then I would go in at 3 and 4 kilos to the acre in a pack to get a good hold of Cocksfoot. But you've got to be able to manage it.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Well, there's one or two more coming, but we'll deal with them, at the right moment or at the end. Over to you, William.
Right, thanks, Helen. Thanks, Ben. We'll be back to Ben just in a wee minute or two. And in this section, we're going to deal briefly with the herbs and clovers. We're going to deal with these in a more detailed look at them in a webinar on multi-species, when we'll include a lot of this in a greater detail on the 8th of June. But we'll start off, there we go, if it will move. There we go. If we'll start off, we'll look at white clover. And something that came to light, I've learned just recently, is one of the side effects of the drive for increased production after the Second World War was the reduction in the sales of all legume seeds. They fell by 80% in a 40-year period. But this is something that we're seeing is starting to reverse now, because there's concerns about sustainability, looking to reduce the amount of nitrogen fertilizer being used on farm, and also the environmental impact that the production of that environment that nitrogen has. So we're seeing far more legumes being used on farm, and the predominant one is white clover, and it's used in usually with perennial ryegrass and along with other grass species as well. And as well as that nitrogen fixation effect and the fact that it's going to transfer that nitrogen to its companion grasses, we also have an increase in livestock performance by increased dry matter intakes, and with the stoloniferous growth of a white clover, which helps it to spread out and aids in grazing tolerance, which some of the legumes aren't tolerant of. Just a wee bit about how white clovers are classed. On the recommended list that Ben was talking about earlier, we have a section for white clovers, and they're classed in terms of their leaf size. And you see here we're looking at small leaf clovers for intensive grazing, and then working up the side leaf sizes for mixed grazing, cattle grazing, and then for silage mixtures as well. But when you look in the recommended list, the average for the dry matter yield, and it's taken in the second harvest year, is about 4.9 tonnes of dry matter. Now this range is affected by the leaf size. The smaller leaf ones, perhaps about 80% of that, and the larger leaf ones can be up to 120% of that. So it's knowing what you're looking to do with that white clover in terms of the grazing management or the cutting management will impact what variety you choose to include in your mixes. Now this is a young clover plant that we see here. You can see that ball root, which indicates that it is young, and through time that will eventually disappear, and the plant will sustain itself through its stoloniferous growth. And the stolons are those horizontal stems that you see in the picture moving out from left to right. So once the plant is established, the tip of the stolon is the growing point of that plant. And larger leaves usually have a longer petiole. Now that's the stem that's coming up off the stolon, and to get up to capture light and help it to compete within the grass sward. Along the stolons there, you can see there are small nodes between the leaf stalks, and each of these nodes is where it touches the ground can form advantageous roots, which help to anchor it to the ground and help it to draw nutrients out of the ground at the same time. and that's how it extends along the growth pattern extends along the ground. Now, in a young plant like this, it's important to mention the mechanical damage that can be caused by the likes of aerators or slitters or trailing shoes, putting on slurry and that sort of thing. You can see there with those tender young stolons how they can be ripped and damaged. And if that young clover plant hasn't got down its advantageous roots to hold it down and anchor it to the ground, then you're going to damage those leaves and they can die off before they've had the opportunity to anchor themselves at various points along the stolon. But in a well-established clover plant, this is much less of a problem, and using some of these mechanical devices can also perhaps contribute to avoiding issues of clover dominance that we occasionally see at various times of the year or in various situations. And clover dominance can come about where you have an open sward that's particularly being cut down low and really cut low, and what that does, it lets light straight into the roots, and it lets the stolons can get down there, and they can fill in the spaces between the plants. And because the grass plants have been cut so short, they only need to put up a short petiole to then get the leaf out to start and photosynthesize. So they're not using a lot of energy in terms of getting the leaf up to photosynthesize. They can use that energy at the growing point at the tip of the stolon to spread out and create this clover dominance that we occasionally see. And one of the other things about the growth cycle of white clover is it's far flatter than grass. And quite often if you look at the growth curves, you'll see that the grass peaks late May, early June when it's its peak growth, and then it goes into a lag phase before it comes back later in the autumn. And when that grass plant is in its lag phase, predominantly I'm talking about perennial ryegrasses here, that's the time of year when your white clovers are at the peak of their growth. So they're filling out and helping to aid the dry matter production throughout the year and in your swards. And just having a quick look at some of the characteristics of the digestibility and the crude protein from your white clover here, you can see that it's really high D value, high protein, and because of that, you're lifting the dry matter intakes. And the two together, and we'll see that in the next slide, has a big impact on livestock performance. But not only is there an impact on the performance, but if you look at the mineral content of your white clover there, you've got extra calcium there for the synthesis of milk. You've got higher levels of selenium there, and selenium is important for a muscle tone within livestock. So all of these things are aiding to the general health and well-being of the stock, as well as adding to the protein of the sward and energy that the livestock consume. Now this is just a wee bit of an effect of what white clover can production. You see here we've got three trials that were set up with the checkers in Southern Ireland. You've got grass only, 250 kgs N, grass and clover, the same level of nitrogen, and then you've also got grass clover with a reduced level of nitrogen at 150 kgs. And what's really encouraging to see there is that that clover is producing higher levels of solids, which is the most important thing in these spring block calving herds in Southern Ireland. So you're getting a higher solids, you're getting higher output, but it's costing you less to grow the grass to get that higher output. And just in case you think that there's any sort of issues there in terms of output, those three swards were all producing, the first one with the grass only was about 14 tons of dry matter. The grass and clover with the same fertilizer was about 14.6, and the grass and clover with the 150s kgs was producing 13.4 tons of dry matter. And the stocking rates were all the same, round about that, 2.5 cows per hectare. So you can see that the benefit, it's not just in terms of the output, but it's reducing the cost in terms of the producing that. Now, one of the things that you've heard, anybody that's heard any of us speak about, will talk about, is the establishment. It's such a vital thing to get the soil pHs right. Everything starts there. Get those soil samples done in plenty of time to make sure you've got your pHs and your P and K indices at the right levels. And the cardinal sin, particularly with clover, is sowing it too deep. It's got to be in the surface and get it rolled down there. And you'll see in that where we've got the seed rates mentioned there, the reason for that is that the white clover, there's 3 times as many seeds in a kilo of white clover as there is red clover. So that's why we have a lower seed rate to get the same number of plants. Moving on to look at red clover. Now, historically, red clover was the main source of homegrown protein in a lot of UK farms. When it's grown in a pure stand on its own, it has the potential to yield a similar amount of tons of dry matter as perennial ryegrass. But when they're grown in a mixed sward along with perennial ryegrass, you get the benefit there of that nitrogen fixing and the nitrogen transferred to the companion grasses, and you'll get that extra 75 to 100 kgs of nitrogen available for the companion grasses. So you're getting that good mix there. And one of the things to really think about is the polyphenol oxidase effect that it has in the protein and the protein that it has in the silage and then ultimately the rumen. Now, crude protein is what's looked at when you're looking for rationing cattle. It tends to include all your non-protein nitrogen as well, whereas the RDP, the rumen degradable protein, that's the supply of protein available to the rumen microbes. Now, this is rapidly degraded, and as much as 70% of that can be lost, whereas the digestible undegraded protein, the DUP, is the protein that's available from the feed, which escapes rumen degradation and is then used by that ruminant further on in the digestive tract to produce milk or meat. So very often when you look at an analysis from a red clover silage, the crude proteins will be slightly higher, but not an awful lot of difference. But what you find is that livestock performance is far better with the red clover silage than it is when it's not included. And that's just due to this, the DUP fraction of the protein there. Grazing red clover leys. This is a red clover ley in the picture there with a mixed species in it with some chicory and various other elements included in it. It's a fantastic crop for finishing lambs on. But it's really important when you go to graze it with the lambs to be careful how you introduce it. You don't want those lambs go on hungry or in wet conditions where they can gorge themselves and then be liable to bloat. You need to have them going on reasonably full or have some source of fibre there to help them transition onto it, because it is really rocket fuel for those lambs. You can get them producing really well with high growth rates and help finish those lambs. But it's also worth noting and mentioning here that red clover has high levels of the phytoestrogens. So you really want to avoid mating and breeding ewes on it for 6 weeks pre and 6 weeks post tupping, because it can have an adverse effect on fertility. We mainly see red clover swards being used for silage leys. We would always say in the year of establishment, you want to take a light cut there to deal with any annual weeds that come along, and then you get the full benefit and have a cleaner sward in the following seasons after that. And it's really, really important when you do cut it, the cutting height, you want to be having a high stubble, 7 to 8 centimetres, because the last thing you want to do is damage the crown of that red clover plant. As we'll mention in a minute or two, that's what affects the persistency of it. And when you're grazing the red clover or cutting the red clover sward, we used to say that you wanted that 50% ear flower buds there, but some work that Germinal and Ibers undertook together, we discovered that the optimum time for cutting red clover leys is just when the early flower buds are beginning to show. This is when you're at that optimum point between quality and yield, and you get the best return in terms of the quality of the silage with the crude protein and the protein availability of it. And it's very, very important with red clover how you manage that crop when you're cutting it in the field, because all that protein is in the leaf, and you really want to treat it very gently to make sure that you get it into the clamp or the bale to get the full advantage of it. So you want to be cutting it with a plain mower. You don't want to be tearing it out and hitting it too hard, because you then have to rake it up once it's wilted. And when you do that, you're getting leaf shatter and you leave the leaf lying in the field. And that's the important bit. That's the bit where all the protein is. So it's very, very important to try and treat it gently when you're using it for a silage mix. And because clover is low in water-soluble carbohydrates, it's really a good fermentation can be achieved when you use a high sugar grass with it, and it's normally advisable to include an additive at the same time to try and make sure you get that fermentation there. We mentioned damaging the crown with the mowers. If you damage the crown, you affect the persistency. And what that does, it lets in water, and you end up with the bacterial sclerotinia getting into your red clover plant, and that kills it out and it rots it over the winter months. So if you're going to be grazing red clover sward at the tail end of the year, you want to be careful and not put a big heavy cattle on it when it's really wet, because if you damage that crown, then what happens is you reduce the persistency and you reduce the amount of red clover that's there the following season. Plant breeders, one of the things they really are working on is trying to improve the persistency of it, and they're screening for resistance to sclerotinia and stem nematode, so that hopefully in the future this won't be such a big issue. But currently we would always recommend rotation between red clover crops of between 5 and 7 years, depending on the potential problems that are there with pests and diseases. Very briefly, just a quick word about lucerne, a fantastic legume there and a great protein crop, but for UK conditions we really need to use inoculated seed, as the rhizobium aren't native to most UK soils. And the thing really to mention here is that we need free draining soils and pHs of over 6.5. And it's worth, if you're thinking about it, having a broad spectrum soil test done, because molybdenum is one of the elements that's really required for the rhizobium and the nitrogen fixation. Now, we're going to have a webinar devoted to lucerne on the 13th of April, when we'll go into the benefits of it, and we'll also have some testimonials from farmers that evening, if they're still willing to do it, on the 13th of April. So I see Ben's laughing because it's him that's to try and organise these two farmers to speak on it. Very briefly, we'll talk about multi-species. As I said earlier, we're going to have a webinar on this on the 8th of June. A simple multi-species is one grass, one herb and one legume. And you can then, after that, you can make it as complicated or as simple as you like, depending on the circumstances and what you're wishing to do. So very briefly tonight, in these boxes, the top row of boxes there are the species that we would use for high production, high livestock production, mixed species swards. And then in the boxes below that, there are other species there which fit in certain circumstances, and it's worth knowing what they are, before you go ahead and use them. And we'll go into those in more detail in the webinar on the 8th of June, as I said. But very briefly, the two major agricultural herbs that we use are tonic plantain and Puna 2 chicory. They're both fantastic crops for adding to the performance of livestock with year-round production. They both grow about the same amount of dry matter, but Puna 2 chicory will grow it during the mid-season, whereas the tonic plantain has a wider window of growth. It grows more at the shoulders of the season, and then is a fantastic protein addition to a grass ley. For example, using lambs going on to it, it boosts performance of boosts the milk production, so therefore it aids lamb growth. We'll talk about these more fully as well on the webinar, but they do have a fantastic drought resistance due to the taproot on your chicory and the ball root on the plantain. And some of the other species that we'll look at that night are sandfoin there, birch trefoil, and burnet, and some sheep's parsley as well. And we'll discuss these and where they're going to fit in at various times as well. And that is all from me at the moment, and we'll pass back to Ben for the remainder of the webinar.
Just while we're handing over, we're getting a huge lot of some very, very good questions coming in. Because time's moving on, I propose that we try and crack on and let Ben answer, or not answer, but Ben carry on with his presentation on mixture formulation, and then hopefully there'll be still a little bit of time to answer some of these questions. So there's excellent questions coming in. Please carry on, and but we'll just let Ben finish his presentation now, and then we'll deal with them.
Does that screen look right now, William?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So just to round up here, or just finish off, why do we sow mixtures at all? Why don't we work like New Zealand and parts of Ireland, where we only sow one variety of grass or two at most? Here's some work that's done actually in Northern Ireland, at AFBI. Trevor Gilliland's done this. 9 different varieties of perennial ryegrass, early to late, and made up 45 different mixtures. Now, to be fair, these were only 2 and 3 variety mixtures, but it shows the difference between straights and mixtures. And clearly, those of you that are ahead of me will see that in the average dry matter production over a 3-year system, there is very little difference between the mixtures or the straight grasses. And ground cover after 3 years, again, very little difference. Now, if you look hard enough, you'll find work that says a mixture will produce more yield in terms of dry matter in a year than straights. And if you look hard enough, you'll find work that says straights produce more. So why do we grow mixtures? Well, the simple answer is flexibility. We have so many different managements of our fields and so many different livestock types that go onto it. A mixture gives us more flexibility along with our weather patterns. It's not always easy to predict when the silage is going to be taken. So a mixture gives you that. I'll cover this more in a little bit of technical detail in a minute, but that's the basic reason why we sow mixtures. If your grassland management is absolutely bob on and your attention to detail with cutting and silaging and grazing and fertilizer application and slurry and everything else, then by all means grow one variety, because you'll have better quality results from it. But we'll cover that all in a bit later. So I just want to talk about the Ploidy, which of grass varieties is important when you're thinking about mixtures, because all it means is the number of chromosomes in each cell. A tetraploid has twice the number of chromosomes in a cell, so 4 as opposed to 2 with a diploid. And basically, it just gives tetraploids bigger quantity of most characteristics in terms of the shape of the plant and things like that. It's a more upright plant with a thicker leaf. It's a darker green color. It is quicker to establish because the seed is also bigger. And we talked about overseeding in a webinar recently, and tetraploids, and I've mentioned it this evening in hybrids, because most of them are tetraploids. There is a use for them in that scenario. But because they are larger seeds, you get fewer of them in a kilo. You get something like 350,000 tetraploids in a kilo, whereas with a diploid, you'll get 550,000 in a kilo. So the seed rates need to vary according to how much diploid and tetraploid you have in the mixture. And how much diploid and tetraploid you have in the mixture depends on your management and what you're going to do with the grass mixture. So I'm going to try and explain that now. So if we've got grazing leys, we as Germinal would certainly recommend that you'd use a high percentage of perennial ryegrass mixture. I've covered the reasons as to why. We'd want a high percentage of diploid because the diploid is more prostrate growing. It has a higher ground cover, and therefore it gives the ability to have a higher stocking rate. Include white clover and herbs, as William's been talking about with the seed rates he's been mentioning. Yes, by all means, that's what we do if weed control wasn't going to be an issue, because there is issue with herbs and white clover with broadleaf weed control. Yes, by all means, if the conditions allow or the conditions dictate that you need other grass species, then by all means include them. But the biggest thing that I can talk about is we've drummed it in, is use the recommended lists. Okay, we'll go on and have a look at a couple of our mixtures, because it's only fair to look at ours and identify the weakness and strengths in our mixtures as we go along. other than pick on somebody else's mixtures. So with a grazing lay, we've been through those characteristics. With a cutting lay, the first question is, how long do you want it to last? Is it a short-term Italian ryegrass type scenario or a longer-term one? Whichever it is, especially with the longer-term mixtures, the heading date range is massively important in a silage mixture. Each grass variety will come into ear at a certain time in the year. If it's an early or an intermediate or a late heading, those are just the groups of the perennial ryegrass heading date range. And it's important that we know those dates. They vary from year to year, and where you are latitudinally in the country, the further north you are, the later the heading date, the further south, the earlier. The warmer, drier springs tend to bring the heading dates forward. The wetter, colder springs, heading date back, obviously. But if you look in general at the heading date effect of perennial ryegrass, if we plot here the growth curves of perennial ryegrass. So this is an early perennial, lots of growth in end of April and early May, an intermediate, slightly later, middle of May, maximum growth period, and the late perennial. You can see there the difference in their growth characteristics and the shape of the curve. And you remember William talking about this drop off after that initial spring growth, where clovers and herbs can add so much more to leveling out this production in this period here. If we're making silage on the 8th of May, our early perennial ryegrass has reached its peak of production and is now, the plant is dropping back in quality and contribution of yield every day. The intermediate is perfect, but the late perennial, if you've got this big range of heading date range, is nowhere near contributing all this area under the curve that will give you yield. So you're losing there the yield potential of any late perennial in the mixture. If you're going to cut silage on the 21st, 24th of May, then here the late perennial is in perfect sync with the production that you're going to have, that you want for that cutting date. But your early and your intermediate perennials are well past their best and dropping like a stone because they've become lignified and stem, and you've got the ear coming out. So this is where I say, if your grassland management is absolutely bob on in attention to detail and you've got your own kit and you can go when the weather's right, then single varieties or tighter heading date ranges is a better way to go, because the quality of what you produce will be better. If you haven't got that, we need flexibility of a heading date range, but there are extremes to it. If you look here at the bottom of the chart, these are the differences in heading date range of a few mixtures. So if you've got a heading date range where the grasses are 20 days apart, then you're down here for yield. If your heading date range is tight together, then you're up here for yield. This yield in terms of dry matter per hectare, the difference between the two here is 1.4 tons, plus 0.8 to minus 0.6. That is roughly 10% of your annual silage yield just lost by having a large heading date range. So it's massively important that we choose the right heading date range. The rest of it is choose your perennials on merit. Use the recommended list. If you have a higher tetraploid rate in the mixture, fine, but make sure they're the right tetraploid grasses. William's covered red clover, including that in a mixture. We would like to see red clover of a 5-year type grown with perennial ryegrass because of its intersync with the perennial ryegrass. William covered it. Use the recommended lists. So I just quickly want to do some analysis on two mixtures, and this is how I look at mixtures. I'm looking at mixtures every day, all the time. So I use a little table. I simply on a piece of paper draw a quick cross, and then I fill in the 4 components of the cross. So how much intermediate is in the mixture? How much late perennial is in the mixture? I'm looking for, on a grazing mixture, I'm not so worried about the heading date range, although there is a slight decrease in yield if you've got a big range, but it's nowhere near as important on silage mixtures. And I'm looking about the ploidy. In our high sugar grass number 3 mixture, our best-selling grass ley, purely for long-term grazing situations with any livestock, we use 100% diploid, because and that's in this here. This chart is meaningless if you're looking at one mixture. Once you start to look at many mixtures, you can see the patterns of it, and it's a good little trick for anybody that's doing a lot of mixture interrogation. So we're using all diploids because of that ground cover. We're then going to look at the recommended list to make sure that we've got the right grass varieties there. Aberban, Aberlee being very, very high in their D value and quality. Aberzeus being the only grass on the recommended list that after 3 years has a ground cover score of 70. So there are different reasons why we choose different mixtures there. Okay. In a cutting regime, this is a multi-cut system. Again, you can see now when you're comparing to the last mixture, we've increased the balance between the intermediate and the late, and obviously the heading date that comes with that. And we've increased the amount of tetraploid that we've got in the mixture. We've got a 15 kilos high seed rate. To be fair, HSG3 is 15 kilos as well, but we like to have a high seed rate. Reseeding is expensive. The cost of the mixture is about 30 to 40% of doing the job in terms of ploughing and everything else, seedbed fertilizer. So having a high seed rate is important to get it out of the ground quick. You could argue with HSG3 that you could cut the seed rate a bit, but here with a higher percentage of tetraploid, we'd want a higher seed rate. So that's just how I would analyze different mixtures. I hope we've got some to talk about now. I've got just on that heading date characteristic that I was talking about, Aberzeus has a heading date of the 27th of May. Abergain has a heading date of the 4th of June. So we've got an 8-day range here where they're all growing in sync, so that we've got a window of opportunity in terms of weather, but they're all at the same growth stage, so that we're going to have quality silage. The multi-cut angle is a bit of a red herring here, because obviously you're cutting it at about 4 weeks on a much regular basis, so the growth stage of the plant is slightly altered. But if it was, that is the principles of what we're trying to establish in a mixture. So just in summary, when you're looking at mixtures, consider the grass species, consider the ploidy of the species that you've got. Is the seed rate right for what you're trying to do? Check the heading date range if it's a cutting mixture, and think about your management that you're going to put onto that grass ley when it's up and through, and is it right to have herbs and inclusion of clovers and things like that. And above all, as I said, all the way through, use the recommended list, because it's there to help and choose the best varieties. I hope we've got a few questions now. Just put this up there. The next webinar is on the 30th of March. Sorry, it says it clearly there on the page. But yes, thank you very much for your time. Helen, have we got some questions now?
We certainly have, Ben. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in. We'll try and get through as many as we can. So one from Rob earlier on, right at the beginning, who's asking, what varieties should I be using if I want to extend the grazing season as far as possible? Okay,
so 2 answers here. If you're looking for long-term leys, you want to use the perennial ryegrass plant and look at the recommended list for early spring growth and late autumn growth, because there are characteristics on that list that tell you which varieties give more than that. If you are looking for another way of doing it, then hybrid ryegrass is an option for you. It's not as good in the longevity, but what it does have is very, very good early spring growth and very, very good back end growth. So you can increase the production at those ends of the season quite dramatically. The downside is you will need to reseed more regularly because they don't last as long, but they do give you that extra end of season growth period.
And what if we don't want a seed head, Ben? If we're looking for persistency, what would you pick particularly?
Well, okay, I mean, Timothy only comes into ear once in a year, so that has good spring characteristics. I would use something like Abergain, which is a late perennial ryegrass, the 4th of June heading date, but it's got the biggest early spring growth characteristic on the recommended list. It's the main reason why we don't use early perennials anymore, because the breeders have managed to breed in that early spring characteristic without having that renewal of heading date of heading as you go through the season.
A question here from Alex just on mixtures. When you were talking about specific heading dates, for example, the 24th of May, what day are you assuming the grass is sown? Ben, I'll let you answer that.
Okay, so it doesn't matter, because if it's sown the year before, the grass will come through the winter and then automatically be set on its body clock, if you like, to come into ear at the right time, depending on the season. If you've drilled it in the spring, you need to be careful, because the plant needs to vernalize to come into ear. So if you've drilled it in the spring and it hasn't had a certain number of degree C days under a certain temperature, and the vernalization requirement of these plants changes on species, if it hasn't had that cold spell after you've drilled it and it's established, it won't come to ear at all in that first year. So if you drill it very late, then chances are it won't come into ear at all that year. If you've drilled it the year before, it will be as in sequence on the recommended list. The only exception to the rule there is Westerwolds, which is an annual Italian. You drill it in the spring, it will come into ear that year.
Yeah, okay. I'm conscious of the fact that we've had an hour, but I think we could perhaps try another 5 or 10 minutes with some questions. Yeah, is everybody okay with that? So a quick one from Graham. In a cutting mixture, which is being grazed in the early year, early spring, would an all late heading mix be better from a D value and yield point of view if you're then aiming to cut mid-June?
I would say definitely, provided you've got that early spring growth characteristic. If you've picked the right grass varieties to give you that early spring growth that you're then going to graze off, shut it up, apply your fertilizer, and then all in sync. All late perennials will give you that natural growth pattern again for quality silage.
So that's an Abergain sort of thing again, isn't it?
Again, it's the Abergain argument, but also Aberzeus, Aberdart, grass varieties that have tremendous spring growth, but also, produce through later in the year.
Another one for you, Ben. Richard's asked, what would you suggest the inclusion rate of your Festulolium with perennial would be in a grazing ley?
If it is the perennial type Festulolium, the honest answer is we have more work to do. That's why we've got the trials at the research station in Melksham and also on farm in various different places. I showed you the photo from the one at Exeter. We don't believe that there is any negative effect of including the Festulolium in a perennial ryegrass ley if it's that perennial type Festulolium. So there wouldn't be a worry about it. The fact is we only have one recommended list variety, if it even gets on. So I would say 3 to 4 kilos at this moment. We've tried it all last summer, where we have drilled, and the results have yet to be found. Sorry, I'm going on here. We have put half the grass mixture in drought situations down to the perennial type Festulolium to see how it works in the field, so that we're putting into practice before we bring it to the market and we know what the answers are. Okay,
thank you. Quick one for either of you really, but Ben, if you're on grass, what's the best blend of types of seeds required to overseed in a southwest wet Scotland? Overseeding mixture for southwest Scotland.
Okay, well, okay, it depends. It depends on how long you want the ley that you're overseeding into to last. If it's for long-term longevity, then if we can open up that grass sward so that we can get seed to soil contact of the seeds, and we can stop the grass that's there growing back, I would use the mixture that you'd sow if you were going to drill it from scratch, and go at about 2/3 rate, 10 kilos to the acre. If you're just looking to increase the viability and the production from that ley just for a year or two, then pick the tetraploids because of that quick early growth. They won't be there after 4 or 5 more years, but at least you've got that good growth and they've got more chance of them striking in that overseeding situation.
Thank you. Quick question for you again, Ben, on Cocksfoot from David. Grazing interval on Cocksfoot in the east of England, far east of England, very dry.
Very much tighter than you would expect for a traditional rotational grazing system, anywhere between 15 and 30 days. If you're going to grow Cocksfoot and you've got Cocksfoot as I've suggested, in a big quantity in the sward, then you have to manage it as such. And the way Cocksfoot grows is the leaf comes out of the shoot rather than new leaves forming slightly differently. And you'll notice Cocksfoot, if you've got it in a mixture, is the first plant to come back after a defoliation, and therefore you have to keep defoliating it, otherwise it gets these jagged silicon points on the side of the leaf, and that you'll watch the cow wrap her tongue around it and physically unlike the physical structure of the leaf and unwrap. So you need to keep on top of it before those things happen. So I would
think hard and regularly.
Yeah, very hard and regularly.
Yeah. Okay. William, I think these are probably a little bit more for you. So can you use white clover ley straight after a red clover ley? Are there any issues with using white clover in your red clover rotation?
No, it's the clover crash. The clover crash comes with red clover and due to the sclerotinia and the stem nematode. So you can go straight in with a white clover after your red clover. So that there's no problem there.
Okay, and another one just on now we've no clover safe, or at the moment we have no clover safe herbicides available. I think maybe people listening that might have something to say about that in the future. Any comments on stitching in either white and or red clover in the absence of those clover safe sprays? So clean a layout first of all and then stitch them in.
Right. The first point to ask there is if I would ask is if you're stitching in or want to stitch in red clover, which is not as successful or harder to do, as long as you're not doing it into an existing red clover sward, that's fine. You might get away with it, but you have to be careful how you do it. But you get away with stitching in a white clover without any problem if you've had to spray for docks, as long as you get it grazed down well so you can get the seed to soil contact and get that seed on the surface and get it established and get light there down to it.
Okay, thank you. And what would be the protein content of a pure stand of red clover? I think we might have had that in it.
I had that one.
Yeah.
Pure stand of red clover, I would be expecting it to be up there in that fully 17%, 90%, depending on the stage you cut it at, but it's going to be at least that, depending on when you cut it.
Around the 20.
The analysis of that is also difficult, isn't it? Whether we're using NIR or wet chemistry on the silage analysis, it needs to be interpreted properly there.
Yeah, I think on that point, I would say that if you're using pure red clover, NIR isn't as accurate because there's not been enough samples done to calibrate the NIR machines the way there is with a grass and clover sward, whereas you have a far higher reliability level. If you want a true analysis, it's more expensive, but wet chemistry will give you a far more accurate reading with a pure red clover stand than NIR would.
Yeah, cows will tell you. And what about an N regime on a red clover ley?
Once you've got it established, if you're putting slurry or farm herb manure on it, no, fine.
Shouldn't need any.
You need it. It'll capture its own nitrogen, so no.
Yeah, and what would be an N? It might be me that needs to answer. What about an N recommendation for a spring reseed?
I saw this question, and you're the only one that's allowed to answer this because you're fax qualified.
60 kilos per hectare, Peter. Amount of N recommended on a spring reseed. Depends a little bit on soil mineral status now and various other things like that, but approximately 60 kilos a hectare. Where have I got to? Okay. Is there a benefit to including a herbal ley as part of a rotation, or would it be better and more effective as the whole rotation?
Right. The big issue there is the way that the rumen adapts to changes in diet. If you're going to have them onto the herbal ley and you can have them on it for a long enough period of time, then that's fine. But if you can only have one field of it, then what I would suggest is that you subdivide that field and have a certain class of stock, for example, lambs that you're planning to finish, and rotationally graze them on it and keep them on it, so that once you've got the rumen adapted to that change in diet, then you're not changing them back onto pure grass. And I would split the classes of stock to take advantage of it if you've only got a limited area of it, rather than putting them all on and all off.
Yeah. So when we have a grazing or a mixed red clover and grazing ley compared to a monoculture of red clover, are there still issues in that gap that you're talking about, the build-up of stem nematodes and pest? Do we still have to observe those strict rotation issues? This is a question from David.
I would say yes, you do. To be safe, I don't think it's worth risking it, because as Ben said there earlier, establishing a new ley is expensive, and establishing a new ley, including red clover, because of the cost of the seed, is more expensive. So it's not worth taking the risk.
The best time to sow red clover, William, the best time of year?
The best time of year, you want to do it when the soils are warm. You want them to be over 8 degrees centigrade to get them established. And it depends where you are in the country. The cut-off point, I would suggest you want them in in Ben's part of the world, in the south of the country, I would suggest mid-August. And in my part of the countryside, I would say last days of July at the latest, because you want them established to be strong enough. Personal preference is I would prefer to establish them in the spring once the soils have warmed up, to get them well enough established to cope with the first winter. But if it has to be an autumn one, make sure that the soil temperatures are above 8 degrees C, to then get them well enough established to cope with that first winter.
Yeah, thank you. Look, we've still got quite a lot of questions to answer, but I'm conscious of the fact that it's 20 to 9 already. So I think we'd better stop. John Ferry, our herbage seed production manager, has just commented on Italian ryegrass and herbicide resistance to say that the issue is grass weed control in the following crops, particularly cereals, and it's becoming a bigger problem than potentially the resistance in blackgrass to some herbicides. So there is more information. John Cousins of NIAB has some information covering the issue, and there is no herbicide resistance in any other ryegrasses or hybrids. So that's sort of put that one to bed for us. We still have quite a few questions here. We will get back to you with all of them. They're all there. We've got them logged, so we'll respond to everybody. So just once more, I want to thank everybody for their time. A few quick notices which we've already touched on. 30th of March, we've got a Brassica webinar on establishment and management. Excuse me. 13th of April, it's a Lucerne webinar. And then, as William said, a bit later on, during the first week in June, we've got the multi-species. Excuse me. There are basis and dairy pro points for tonight, which you should have put your name down as you registered, and then they will be allocated. If you have a problem with it, just get in touch with us and we'll sort it out for you. So thank you very, very much, everybody. And yeah, we'll be back in touch soon. But thank you very much for your time tonight, and thanks to Ben and William for their time and knowledge sharing tonight.